Alyssa Carter had never been a person who enjoyed excessive attention or unnecessary fanfare. She preferred solitude, a quiet space where her mind could work uninterrupted, shaping the ideas that had made her successful in her career as an architect. Life hadn't always been easy for Alyssa. After the sudden death of her husband, it had been a struggle not just emotionally, but financially. For years, she had kept herself and her daughter afloat by designing modest homes, often taking on multiple projects at once, working late into the night to meet deadlines. It was in these moments, alone with her sketches and plans, that she found solace. When Alyssa finally found time to breathe, she made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She decided to invest in something that she had always wanted, a house that reflected her vision, her ambition, and her resilience. After months of searching for the perfect property, Alyssa had purchased an old, dilapidated house at the edge of a suburban neighborhood. It wasn't much at first, just a single-story home with outdated interiors, a roof that needed replacing, and walls that had seen better days. But Alyssa saw potential. She had a vision, and with her professional skills she began transforming the house into something extraordinary. The centerpiece of this transformation was the roof, a solar array unlike any other in the neighborhood. Alyssa had always been fascinated by sustainable design, and the idea of harnessing the power of the sun to make her home self-sufficient was not just practical, but deeply symbolic. It represented independence, the ability to control her environment and, in a sense, her future. Each panel was meticulously chosen, the installation overseen by an experienced crew. The solar system was more than just an energy-saving solution. It was a statement. Alyssa knew it would give her home a level of self-reliance that was rare in her neighborhood, and she took pride in it. But Alyssa's success, her pride in her hard-earned independence, would soon be tested by a force she had never anticipated, her Homeowners Association, HOA. It all began one crisp morning when Alyssa received an unexpected letter in the mail. She had grown accustomed to receiving notifications from the HOA about various community matters, but this letter was different. It was formal, with the HOA's logo embossed in bold letters at the top. The words on the page were sharp and cold, detailing a grievance that seemed utterly absurd. According to the HOA, the solar panels Alyssa had installed on her roof were not hers to own. The letter claimed that the panels were installed on what they considered common property, and as a result they belonged to the association, not her. They were giving her an ultimatum. Either sign a transfer of the ownership of the panels to the HOA, or they would be removed, and she would face legal consequences. Alyssa's first reaction was disbelief. How could this be happening? She had made sure to follow every regulation, every step of the process when installing her solar panels. She had the necessary permits, and there was no question in her mind that her home, and by extension, her roof, was hers. She had poured countless hours into the renovation, even using some of her savings to pay for the solar panels, something she knew would benefit not only her financially, but also reduce her carbon footprint. The thought that the HOA could simply claim ownership of her property felt like an invasion, a violation of the very idea of what it meant to be a homeowner. But the letter wasn't just a request, it was a demand, a forceful statement of control. The HOA president, Gavin Ross, had made it clear that the association would not tolerate any unauthorized modifications to the property, regardless of whether those modifications were legal or not. Alyssa wasn't naive enough to think this was a simple misunderstanding. She had heard whispers from neighbors about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, their relentless pursuit of conformity, their constant encroachments on residents' rights. But Alyssa had always considered herself immune to their influence. She had her own plans, her own vision, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even the HOA, dictate how she lived. Yet, as she sat in her living room, staring at the letter in disbelief, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. The HOA was powerful. They had connections, resources, and a deep knowledge of the legal intricacies that could make it nearly impossible for a single individual to fight them. Alyssa knew that any confrontation with the HOA would be a battle, one that could have lasting consequences for her home, her finances, and her family's future. The decision to fight them wasn't easy. Alyssa didn't want to get involved in a drawn-out legal battle, especially one that could lead to costly fines or the removal of the very thing that had given her home so much value. But there was something inside her that refused to back down. She had worked too hard to build her life, to create a place where she and her daughter could thrive without the weight of oppressive rules hanging over them. The idea of losing control of her property, of being dictated to by a group of people who had no understanding of what it took to build a life from scratch, made her blood boil. Alyssa spent the next few days researching everything she could about the HOA, about the rules, about the legal landscape she was about to step into. She talked to neighbors who had dealt with the HOA before, but most of them were too frightened to speak out against it. It was clear that the HOA had a reputation for crushing dissent, using their power to silence anyone who dared to challenge them. But Alyssa wasn't like the others. She had spent years making decisions for herself, shaping her own destiny. She wasn't about to let some bureaucratic group take that away from her. At first, Alyssa thought the situation could be resolved with a simple conversation. She thought that if she just explained her side of the story, the HOA would see reason and back off. She tried reaching out to Gavin Ross, hoping that a direct conversation would clear things up. But Ross wasn't interested in listening. He was dismissive, his words dripping with condescension as he reminded her that the HOA had a responsibility to uphold the integrity of the community. His words were a thinly veiled threat. He made it clear that if she didn't comply, they would pursue legal action. She would lose her panels, and perhaps even her home. The more he spoke, the more Alyssa realized that this wasn't about solar panels or regulations. It was about control. The HOA wasn't just interested in maintaining order. They wanted power over their residents, an iron grip on every aspect of their lives. Alyssa realized that her situation wasn't just about the panels. It was a symbol of something much bigger. It was about her autonomy, her right to make decisions for her family and herself. And she wasn't willing to let anyone take that away from her. This would be a fight that would take her to places she never expected. But Alyssa Carter was ready. She would take the battle to the HOA, no matter the cost. And she would fight not just for her home, but for her right to exist on her own terms. Alyssa Carter was not a woman who typically welcomed confrontation, especially not when it came to something as deeply personal as her home. Her house had been a dream realized, a project that had taken years of planning, sacrifice, and hard work. From the moment she and her daughter had moved into the small, outdated property on the edge of town, Alyssa had poured her heart into transforming it into something that was not just a house, but a symbol of resilience, of moving forward. The decision to install the solar panels had come out of a sense of necessity, but also a deep commitment to the future. Hers, her daughter's, and the planet's. The panels were an investment in self-sufficiency, in ensuring that the roof over their heads was more than just a shelter, but a source of power and energy, a step toward reducing their carbon footprint and lowering their utility bills for years to come. When Alyssa had first begun working on the house, she knew it would require a certain amount of creativity and resourcefulness. The house itself was modest, too small for a family of 3, but just large enough to feel like a real home. It needed a new roof, a new kitchen, a new foundation, essentially everything. But Alyssa had a clear vision for how she wanted the space to function, and she had a reputation as a talented architect in her own right. Her years of experience in designing sustainable buildings and working with alternative energy solutions meant that she knew how to make her dream a reality, even on a modest budget. She had been meticulous with every detail. The solar panels were installed with care, positioned to optimize their exposure to sunlight while also complementing the aesthetics of the home. She had worked closely with a trusted contractor, ensuring that everything was above board, that the permits were in place, and that the installation met all legal requirements. It was a costly project, one that drained the last of her savings, but it felt like the right choice. The panels would save her money in the long run, and they gave her a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment that she could point to whenever she thought about the future. They were not just panels. They were an investment in her family's well-being. Alyssa had never once imagined that her decision to improve her home in such a sustainable and forward-thinking way would be the source of conflict. But that was exactly what happened when the letter arrived in the mail, bearing the unmistakable insignia of the local homeowners association. She hadn't thought much about the HOA before. They were just a distant entity that issued regular reminders about yard maintenance, street cleaning, and other mundane regulations. Alyssa was someone who preferred to live under the radar, someone who didn't ruffle feathers or draw attention to herself. She had never been involved in any of the community meetings, never felt the need to adhere to the petty rules they imposed. Her relationship with the HOA, in her mind, had been nothing more than a formality. Until now. The letter was thick, official-looking. Alyssa's heart sank the moment she read the first few lines. According to the HOA, the solar panels on her roof were not hers to own. The letter claimed that the panels had been installed on common property, and as such they technically belonged to the HOA. They demanded that Alyssa either transfer ownership of the panels to the association or face the consequences. Removal of the panels and the legal fees for doing so. The tone was blunt, matter-of-fact, and utterly devoid of any empathy for Alyssa's situation. At first, Alyssa thought it must be a mistake. She reread the letter twice, searching for some hint of misunderstanding. The document referenced the installation of the panels, the exact location of her property, and even cited a clause in the HOA's rules that supposedly gave them the right to seize any improvements made to the property that affected the aesthetic, uniformity of the neighborhood. It didn't make sense to Alyssa. She had gone through the proper channels, received the necessary permits, and followed all the regulations. This wasn't just a matter of personal investment, it was a matter of legal and ethical ownership. The more she read, the angrier she became. Alyssa felt a rush of heat rising in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was reading. How could this be happening? The solar panels were her property, her choice, her investment. They weren't just pieces of equipment. They were a symbol of her independence, her commitment to creating a better life for herself and her daughter. They were part of the home she had spent so many sleepless nights designing and rebuilding. The idea that someone, especially an anonymous body like the HOA, could simply lay claim to them, to something so integral to her vision of home, felt like a violation on a deeply personal level. As the shock began to wear off, Alyssa's mind went into overdrive. She needed to understand what had happened. She needed answers. The first step was to contact the HOA directly, to get some clarity. But when she called the number listed on the letter, she was met with an indifferent voice on the other end. The woman who answered sounded as though she had heard this complaint 1,000 times before, as if she had no real stake in the situation. Alyssa tried to explain her side of the story, to articulate that the panels were installed legally and with the proper permissions. But the woman simply repeated the same line over and over. The panels were installed on common property. They belong to the association. It's a matter of policy. Frustrated and unable to get any further information, Alyssa asked to speak to Gavin Ross, the president of the HOA. She had heard of him before. He was known to be a staunch enforcer of the rules, someone who rarely took exceptions. Alyssa was certain that if anyone could shed light on this situation, it would be him. But when she was finally connected to Ross, she was taken aback by his condescending tone. He didn't bother to explain or try to resolve the matter in any meaningful way. Instead, he told her flatly that the HOA had the right to seize the panels because they violated the neighborhood's uniformity rules, and if she didn't comply, they would proceed with legal action. Alyssa tried to argue her case, but Ross was dismissive, uninterested in anything she had to say. His position was clear. The HOA had made a decision, and it would not be changed. He even suggested that she might be better off moving to another neighborhood if she wasn't willing to follow the rules. The sheer audacity of his response shocked Alyssa into silence. It was clear that the HOA wasn't interested in understanding her perspective or even listening to her concerns. They had the power, and they were going to use it. After the call ended, Alyssa sat quietly in her living room, trying to process what had just happened. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. This wasn't just about the panels anymore. It was about control. It was about the HOA asserting its authority over her home, over her decisions, over her life. She had always believed that homeownership meant independence, that when you owned a home, you had the right to make decisions about it without being told what you could or couldn't do. But now, Alyssa was being forced to realize that in her neighborhood, the HOA held the reins. They were the ones in charge, and they were the ones who decided what was best for everyone, whether the residents liked it or not. The next few days were filled with anxiety. Alyssa tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the panels, to the looming threat of legal action, and to the overwhelming sense of injustice she felt. She knew she had to act, but she wasn't sure what the best course of action was. Should she fight them? Should she hire a lawyer and risk the time and money it would take to battle the HOA in court? Or should she just comply, sign the transfer of ownership, and hope that they would leave her alone? As the days dragged on, Alyssa became more and more determined. She wasn't going to let the HOA win. She wasn't going to let them take away something that was hers, something she had worked so hard for. But the question remained. How could she fight back without risking everything she had? Alyssa realized she wasn't just fighting for solar panels. She was fighting for her right to live freely, to make decisions for herself, and to protect the home that meant everything to her. It was at this moment that she made a decision. She would not back down. She would fight the HOA, not with anger, but with strategy. She would find a way to expose the weaknesses in their case, to show the world that the HOA was not as invincible as they seemed. And in doing so, she would reclaim control of her home, her sanctuary. The days following her conversation with Gavin Ross felt endless for Alyssa. Every waking moment seemed to be consumed by thoughts of the HOA and their relentless demands. At first, she had hoped that the situation would somehow resolve itself, that the HOA would back off once they realized how much effort she had put into her home, how committed she was to making it a sustainable, self-sufficient place for her daughter and herself. But as the days passed, it became clear that they were not going to simply let it go. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore. It was about control, power, and the HOA's insistence on imposing their will upon the homeowners of the neighborhood. The pressure began to mount on Alyssa. The first indication that things were escalating came when she received a second letter from the HOA. This one was more formal and ominous. It began with a reminder of the previous communication she had received regarding the solar panels, followed by a stern warning. The letter stated that if she didn't comply with their demands and transfer ownership of the panels to the HOA, they would initiate the process of removal. The letter also mentioned that her refusal could result in legal action, and it cited a specific clause in the HOA's rules that allowed them to take such measures. This clause, according to the letter, was non-negotiable, and Alyssa's failure to comply would result in further legal consequences. The tone was cold, authoritarian, and unmistakably threatening. Reading the letter, Alyssa felt her stomach churn. This wasn't just a request anymore. It was a declaration of war. The HOA had made their position clear. They were not going to back down. But what alarmed her more than the letter itself was the subtle yet undeniable sense of intimidation embedded within its language. There was no room for negotiation, no acknowledgement of the effort she had made in her home, no understanding of her rights as a homeowner. It was simply a demand comply, or face the consequences. Alyssa's immediate response was anger. She had always prided herself on being a capable, independent woman who could handle whatever life threw her way. But this was different. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a direct assault on her home, her sanctuary. She felt as if the very foundation of her existence had been shaken. What had started as a dream project, a personal victory, was now threatening to unravel before her eyes. Determined not to back down, Alyssa decided it was time to take action. She had spent the past few days researching everything she could about the HOA and their rules. She reached out to her lawyer, Sarah Bennett, a woman she had worked with on several architectural projects in the past. Sarah was sharp, no nonsense, and had a reputation for fighting tooth and nail for her clients. Alyssa hoped that Sarah could offer some guidance, some insight into the legalities surrounding the situation. After all, Alyssa had always prided herself on following the rules, and she knew that she had done everything by the book when installing the solar panels. Surely there had to be some legal recourse, some way to push back against the HOA's overreach. When Alyssa finally sat down with Sarah, the lawyer's first reaction was one of disbelief. "They're really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "They're actually trying to seize your property over solar panels?" Alyssa nodded, her frustration palpable. She explained everything. The letters, the phone calls with Gavin Ross, and the mounting pressure she felt as the HOA's demands grew more and more aggressive. Sarah listened carefully, making notes, her brow furrowed in thought. When Alyssa finished speaking, Sarah looked up at her, a determined expression on her face. "This isn't just about panels, Alyssa," Sarah said, leaning forward. "This is about power. The HOA is trying to establish control over your property, and if they succeed here, they'll start pushing on other homeowners as well. We can't let that happen." Alyssa nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude toward Sarah. "So, what can we do?" she asked, her voice tinged with a sense of urgency. Sarah paused, considering the options. "First, we need to confirm that you have all the proper documentation, permits, receipts, installation records, anything that proves you went through the right channels. If we're going to fight this, we need to have everything in order." Alyssa assured Sarah that she had all the necessary documents and went through her files with the lawyer, providing her with a comprehensive list of permits, contractor invoices, and photographs of the panels in various stages of installation. Sarah meticulously reviewed everything, nodding along as she checked off each document. When she finished, she looked at Alyssa, her expression hardening. "Okay," Sarah said. "We've got everything we need to prove that you followed all the rules. But we're going to have to be strategic about this. The HOA will try to discredit you, and they'll use every legal loophole they can find to make your life difficult. But if we play our cards right, we can beat them." Alyssa felt a flicker of hope, but she also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA was a powerful entity with resources and connections that could make her life a living hell if they so chose. It wasn't just about winning this fight. It was about protecting everything she had worked for, everything she had built for her daughter. The first step was to take the fight to them, but not in the way they expected. Alyssa knew that if she engaged the HOA directly in a legal battle, they would use every tactic at their disposal to drag the process out, tie her up in paperwork, and financially drain her until she was forced to give up. That was their playbook: intimidation, delay, and bureaucracy. Alyssa wasn't going to play by their rules. Instead of sitting back and waiting for them to make the first move, Alyssa decided to be proactive. She would gather allies, people who understood the system and who could help her fight back. She started reaching out to other homeowners in the community, particularly those who had dealt with the HOA in the past. It wasn't easy. Many of them were fearful of speaking out, afraid of the retribution they might face from the HOA, but Alyssa was persistent. She made phone calls, sent emails, and showed up at neighbors' homes, talking to anyone who would listen. To her surprise, some of her neighbors began to share their own stories of how the HOA had overstepped its bounds in the past. One neighbor, James Holloway, a retired engineer who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, told her how the HOA had once forced him to tear down a shed he had built in his backyard, despite the fact that it had never violated any building codes. Another neighbor, Tina Owens, a schoolteacher, explained how the HOA had fined her repeatedly for trivial issues like leaving her trash cans out too long or planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. The more Alyssa learned, the more she realized that the HOA had been using its power to control the neighborhood for years, bullying homeowners into submission through fear and intimidation. Alyssa's next move was to take the fight to the public. She knew that the HOA relied on the support of the community to maintain its power, and if she could expose their tactics, she could weaken their grip on the neighborhood. She reached out to a local journalist, Ben Carter, who had covered local politics for years and had a reputation for investigating corruption and abuses of power. After explaining her situation, Ben agreed to meet with her, and they discussed how the HOA's overreach could be framed as a story of injustice and corruption. The article that Ben wrote was published a week later. It detailed the history of the HOA's aggressive tactics, including interviews with Alyssa, her neighbors, and even a few former HOA members who had witnessed the association's underhanded practices firsthand. The article painted the HOA as an oppressive, power-hungry organization that cared more about enforcing petty rules than supporting the homeowners in the community. It called out their treatment of Alyssa as a blatant abuse of power, one that could not be tolerated. The article quickly went viral, spreading through the community like wildfire. For the first time, Alyssa felt that she had the upper hand. The HOA, which had been hiding behind its legal jargon and bureaucratic processes, was now exposed. Their dirty tactics were out in the open, and the public was beginning to question whether the HOA had gone too far. Alyssa had ignited a firestorm, and there was no turning back now. The intensity of the situation began to ramp up in ways Alyssa had never anticipated. The weeks after the article ran were filled with both anticipation and dread. On one hand, she felt a surge of hope. Finally, people were listening, and the HOA's once untouchable power seemed to be crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. On the other hand, she knew that the fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to roll over just because a few articles had been written. If anything, Alyssa was now firmly in their crosshairs. The community's response was mixed. Some neighbors expressed their support, while others, particularly those who had been longtime allies of the HOA, began to pull back, wary of the drama that was unfolding. It was becoming clear that, despite the initial backlash, the HOA had deep-rooted influence in the neighborhood, and they weren't about to let a single homeowner bring them down. Alyssa found herself walking a precarious line. While the public support from some of her neighbors gave her a sense of validation, it was also a reminder of how isolated she had become in this battle. The HOA's grip on the community ran deep, and Alyssa was quickly discovering that not everyone was willing to take a stand. The local media, while initially sympathetic to her cause, had begun to lose interest, and in its place, the HOA's own campaign of public relations began to gain traction. They painted Alyssa as a troublemaker, someone who was disrupting the peace of the neighborhood for the sake of personal gain. The fact that she had exposed them in the first place only made them more determined to win back the support of the community and assert their dominance. The tension at home began to grow. Alyssa's daughter, Emily, was starting to feel the weight of the conflict too. At 15, Emily had always been a smart, independent teenager, but the pressure of watching her mother battle an organization that seemed to hold all the cards was taking its toll. She'd been getting increasingly upset about the phone calls from neighbors, the whispers behind her back at school, and the constant reminder that their family was at the center of a heated, public dispute. Alyssa knew that Emily was resilient, but she also understood that this wasn't the life she had envisioned for her daughter. The last thing she wanted was for Emily to feel like an outsider in their own community, to carry the stigma of being the family who fought the HOA. As the days turned into weeks, Alyssa continued to prepare for the inevitable legal showdown. She knew it was coming. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The HOA had already made it clear that they were pursuing a legal remedy, and despite the public support and the media attention, Alyssa knew that this wasn't a battle that could be won in the court of public opinion. She needed to be prepared for the courtroom, and she needed to be ready for the battle that was about to unfold. The first move came in the form of a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal team. The tone of the letter was even more aggressive than the previous ones. This time, they were demanding that Alyssa cease any further attempts to auction off the solar panels, or they would pursue not just civil litigation, but also the possibility of criminal charges for what they were calling theft of HOA property. Alyssa's lawyer, Sarah Bennett, was quick to respond, but the pressure was beginning to build. Alyssa had been warned. This was no longer just about the panels or the house. This was about sending a message to anyone who might think about standing up to the HOA. The stakes had been raised, and Alyssa realized that in order to win this battle, she had to go beyond just the legal fight. She had to gather more evidence, more allies, and more support. This was no longer a simple dispute between a homeowner and a homeowners association. It was a fight for her rights, her family's future, and her place in the community. Alyssa knew that the only way to ensure victory was to expose the HOA for what it was, a corrupt organization that had been using its power to control the residents of the neighborhood for far too long. With Sarah's help, Alyssa began digging deeper. They spent hours combing through the HOA's records, looking for any sign of misconduct or unethical practices. Alyssa's instincts had been right. There was more to this than just the solar panels. The HOA's financial records revealed several discrepancies, including suspicious payments to contractors who had previously worked on neighborhood projects, and documents that hinted at backdoor dealings with local developers. Sarah, who had seen her fair share of shady business dealings in her career, was quick to point out that these were not just minor errors. They were indicative of something much more serious. Alyssa felt a sense of both vindication and dread. She had always suspected that the HOA wasn't as clean as it appeared, but now the evidence was undeniable. As Alyssa and Sarah worked to uncover more information, they began to notice something even more troubling. The HOA wasn't just targeting Alyssa, it was going after other homeowners as well. One neighbor, Mark Davis, a retired accountant, had been forced to comply with the HOA's demands after a series of small fines for what he called trivial violations. Mark had always been an easygoing guy, someone who kept to himself and didn't make waves. But Alyssa discovered that his quiet compliance with the HOA's demands had cost him a significant amount of money, and his property value had been severely impacted by the HOA's refusal to approve any improvements he made to his home. It was becoming clear that the HOA had been systematically targeting homeowners who were either too passive to fight back or too afraid of the potential consequences to speak out. Alyssa began to realize that this was bigger than just a fight over solar panels. The HOA was abusing its power, using its control over the neighborhood's homeowners to maintain a level of influence that was not just unnecessary, it was destructive. The tipping point came when Alyssa discovered that the HOA had attempted to foreclose on another neighbor's property over a minor fee dispute. The homeowner, a widow named Janet who had been living in the neighborhood for over 20 years, had fallen behind on a $200 fee after her husband's death, and the HOA had started foreclosure proceedings against her home. Alyssa couldn't believe what she was reading. This was more than just bad policy. This was exploitation. The HOA was using its legal powers to drive people out of their homes, to push them into financial ruin for the sake of their own bottom line. Alyssa felt a fire ignite within her. She couldn't just fight for herself anymore. She had to fight for Janet, for Mark, for every homeowner in the neighborhood who had been manipulated, bullied, and silenced by the HOA, She wasn't going to stand by and watch them destroy everything she had worked so hard for. She had a choice to make. She could continue to play by the HOA's rules and risk losing everything, or she could expose them for what they were, taking the fight directly to the heart of their corrupt empire. With a renewed sense of purpose, Alyssa doubled down on her efforts. She reached out to more neighbors, organizing meetings in secret to discuss their experiences with the HOA. She knew she had to be careful. If the HOA got wind of her organizing, they would come down on her harder than ever. But the more she spoke to her neighbors, the more she realized that Alyssa was not alone. There were more people who had been victimized by the HOA than she had realized, and together they could form a united front. Alyssa had always known that the road ahead would be difficult, but as she entered the second phase of her battle with the Homeowners Association, HOA, she felt the full weight of the forces against her. The stakes were higher now, and the situation had grown more complicated than she could have ever imagined. What had started as a personal struggle over her solar panels had morphed into something much larger, something far more dangerous than just a matter of property rights. It was a battle of wills, a contest of power, and the HOA had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to maintain their authority over the neighborhood, even if it meant using every dirty trick in the book to get what they wanted. The pressure from the HOA had escalated dramatically in the past few weeks. Their initial attempts to intimidate Alyssa with legal threats and cease-and-desist orders had failed to break her resolve, and now they had moved on to more aggressive tactics. They had filed a formal lawsuit, demanding that Alyssa not only remove the solar panels but also pay restitution for the supposed damage caused to the HOA's property values. The charges were absurd, but the HOA had a way of using legal language to make even the most outrageous claims seem legitimate. Alyssa's lawyer, Sarah Bennett, was confident that they could win the case, but the reality was that this was no longer just about winning in court. The HOA had already set their sights on destroying Alyssa's life, and every move they made was calculated to strip her of her resources and her reputation. In the midst of this escalating conflict, Alyssa's life outside of the battle had begun to unravel. Her daughter, Emily, had always been Alyssa's pillar of strength, but even Emily's patience was wearing thin. The constant stress, the endless phone calls with lawyers and neighbors, the barrage of media attention, everything was taking its toll. Emily had grown tired of hearing about the fight for the house and had started to withdraw, spending more time at school or in her room, avoiding the discussions that Alyssa had once hoped would bring them closer together. It broke Alyssa's heart to see her daughter retreat into herself, but she knew that the fight for her home was also a fight for Emily's future. If she backed down now, the impact would be far worse than any temporary discomfort. At work, things weren't any better. As an architect, Alyssa had built a reputation for being reliable, meticulous, and professional. But now her reputation was being dragged through the mud. The media, once sympathetic to her cause, had started to lose interest as the story became more tangled in legal jargon and public relations battles. The HOA's influence over the local press was undeniable, and they began spinning the narrative to paint Alyssa as a troublemaker, someone who was disrupting the peace of the neighborhood for personal gain. Despite Alyssa's best efforts to maintain her professional life, the battle with the HOA had begun to overshadow everything else. Every meeting, every project she took on, seemed to be clouded by the looming threat of the HOA's power. The turning point came when the HOA escalated the matter to the point of personal attack. Gavin Ross, the president of the HOA, had always been a distant, disinterested figure in Alyssa's eyes, someone who wielded his authority from behind a desk, but now he was personally involved in the fight against her. He began showing up at her door unannounced, making veiled threats about the consequences of her continued defiance. His visits weren't just about legal matters anymore. They were designed to intimidate, to remind Alyssa of the power the HOA had over her life. Each time he knocked on her door, he brought with him a new demand or a new accusation, making it clear that he had no intention of letting her off the hook. He wasn't going to be satisfied until Alyssa had been broken, until her will had been completely crushed. It was during one of these visits that Alyssa made the decision that would change the course of the battle. Gavin had arrived with a stack of papers, newly filed motions, fresh threats of foreclosure, and a long list of fines and penalties. He stood on her doorstep with a smug look on his face, as though the weight of his authority was all that was needed to win. But this time, Alyssa didn't back down. She had seen through his charade. He wasn't just trying to enforce rules, he was trying to control her, to manipulate her into submission. As he handed her the papers, she looked him in the eye and said, "You're not going to win this. I won't let you." The look on Gavin's face shifted from smug confidence to cold, calculating anger. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This is your last chance to settle. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." "I'm not afraid of you," Alyssa replied, her voice steady, but her heart was pounding in her chest. For the first time in the entire battle, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for her property anymore. She was fighting for her dignity, her family, and everything she had worked for. She knew that if she gave in now, everything she had done would be for nothing. Gavin's eyes narrowed, and he turned on his heel without another word, leaving her standing in the doorway with the weight of his threats hanging in the air. But as he walked away, Alyssa felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a fight about solar panels anymore. This was about survival. And she wasn't about to let anyone take away her life, her work, or her home without a fight. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and preparation. Sarah had already been working tirelessly behind the scenes to gather evidence and build a defense, but now the situation had reached a critical point. The HOA had filed a motion for summary judgment, which, if approved, would allow them to seize her property and remove the solar panels. It was a move that could essentially end the battle and leave Alyssa with nothing. But Sarah wasn't about to let that happen. She dug into the HOA's history, looking for any signs of corruption or misconduct that could turn the tide in their favor. What she found was more than just a few legal missteps. There was a pattern of behavior. Years of questionable financial dealings, coercive tactics, and illegal practices that had allowed the HOA to maintain its stranglehold on the neighborhood. Alyssa's heart raced as Sarah shared the findings with her. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice steady with determination. "We've got them. We can't just fight this on the grounds of property rights. We need to expose everything they've done, every shady deal, every illegal action. If we go public with this, we can turn the tables." Alyssa knew Sarah was right. She couldn't just defend herself from the HOA's legal attacks. She needed to strike back, to expose the rot at the core of the HOA's operations. The more Alyssa thought about it, the more she realized that this was about more than just her home. This was about accountability. The HOA had been using its power for too long to bully homeowners, to enrich themselves at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. And now it was time for that to end. But the next steps were dangerous. Going public with the evidence meant that the HOA would come after her with everything they had. It was no longer just about a legal battle. It was about a fight for justice. Alyssa knew that she had to be prepared for whatever came next, even if it meant risking everything. She had already lost so much. She wasn't about to let them take what little she had left. The media campaign began. Alyssa and Sarah worked with investigative reporters to break the story. They exposed the HOA's financial records, their corrupt dealings with contractors, and their systematic efforts to seize properties from homeowners who refused to comply with their demands. The public response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once been silent began to speak out. They shared their own stories of mistreatment and coercion. The HOA, once an unchallenged authority, began to crumble under the weight of the truth. But Alyssa knew that this was just the beginning. The battle had reached a new level, and there was no going back. As the court date approached, Alyssa steeled herself for the fight ahead. She wasn't just defending her home anymore. She was leading a movement to expose the HOA for what it truly was, a corrupt, self-serving organization that had no place in a community that valued fairness and justice. And she would not rest until they were held accountable for the harm they had caused. The weeks leading up to the trial were the longest of Alyssa's life. Every day felt like an eternity, each one bringing more stress, more sleepless nights, and more pressure from the HOA. She had anticipated that the situation would be difficult, but now, as the court date loomed closer, it was becoming clear that this battle was far more than a matter of solar panels or property rights. It was about her identity, her principles, and her future. If she lost this case, it wouldn't just be about the panels. It would be about the erosion of her autonomy, the crumbling of everything she had worked so hard to build. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her struggle wasn't unique. This was bigger than just her. This was about standing up to an institution that had bullied and manipulated people for years. It was about challenging the idea that power could be used to exploit the vulnerable. As the days dragged on, Alyssa prepared herself for the fight of her life. Sarah Bennett, her lawyer, had been working tirelessly to expose the corruption within the HOA. They had gathered an overwhelming amount of evidence, from financial records showing suspicious payments to contractors to a series of internal memos that revealed the HOA's systematic efforts to force homeowners into compliance. They had even uncovered evidence of illegal contracts, fraudulent fines, and backdoor deals that allowed the HOA to line its pockets at the expense of the community. The more they dug, the more they realized just how far-reaching the HOA's corruption went. This wasn't just about the solar panels. It was about years of unchecked power, about a group of individuals who had exploited their position for personal gain, using fear and intimidation to control the lives of the people in the neighborhood. Alyssa was no longer just fighting for her home. She was fighting for every homeowner who had ever been manipulated by the HOA, for every person who had been silenced by their power. She knew that if she didn't win this case, the HOA would only become stronger, more emboldened in their pursuit of control. She had to stand her ground, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the oppressive weight of bureaucracy. The morning of the trial arrived, and Alyssa found herself standing outside the courthouse, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. She had been here before, in the courtroom, watching other people fight for their rights, but now it was her turn. Her lawyer, Sarah, was by her side, offering words of encouragement, though Alyssa could tell that Sarah, too, was feeling the weight of the case. The tension in the air was palpable. As they entered the courtroom, Alyssa felt her heart race, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the sterile, quiet space. The room was filled with lawyers, reporters, and a handful of supporters, neighbors who had rallied behind Alyssa's cause, who had been inspired by her bravery in taking on the HOA. The courtroom was a sea of faces, and Alyssa's gaze briefly flicked over to the other side of the room, where Gavin Ross, the HOA president, sat. He was flanked by his legal team, and his face was set in an expression of steely confidence. Alyssa's stomach churned at the sight of him. This man, who had wielded his power with such arrogance, who had sought to crush her at every turn, was now trying to claim victory in front of a judge. But Alyssa wasn't intimidated. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let this man or anyone else take away everything she had fought for. The trial began, and as Sarah presented their case, Alyssa felt a surge of hope. For the first time, she felt like the truth was on their side, and they had the evidence to prove it. The financial records, the testimonies from former HOA members, the backdoor dealings with contractors, all of it was laid out in front of the judge. The more Sarah spoke, the more it became clear that the HOA's actions were not just an overreach. They were illegal. They had manipulated their authority to seize control of homeowners' property, to profit off the backs of people like Alyssa. And now, the truth was coming to light. The turning point came when Sarah presented the evidence of fraudulent fines imposed on Alyssa's neighbors, including the case of Mark Davis, the retired accountant who had been forced to pay for small, insignificant violations. The evidence showed that the HOA had been targeting vulnerable homeowners for years, collecting fines and fees under false pretenses, and threatening legal action to force people to comply. As the judge listened, Alyssa could see the skepticism in his eyes slowly turning into disbelief. It was one thing to hear accusations. It was another thing to see the full extent of the HOA's corruption laid bare for everyone to see. Alyssa's heart pounded as the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. He turned to the HOA's legal team who had been attempting to defend their actions, and began questioning them in a tone that was both stern and incredulous. "So, you're telling me that this organization, this HOA, has been operating in this manner for years? That these homeowners have been manipulated, fined, and forced into compliance through deceptive practices?" The lawyer representing the HOA stammered, clearly caught off guard by the judge's questions, but Gavin Ross remained silent, his face frozen. In a grimace, the courtroom was silent for a moment, and Alyssa felt as though time had slowed down. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. She had fought for so long, for so many reasons, but now it was in the hands of the judge. Would he see the truth? Would he recognize the manipulation, the exploitation, for what it was? The judge finally turned to Alyssa and her lawyer, his voice calm but filled with authority. "It is clear to me that the actions of the HOA have gone far beyond what is acceptable. The evidence presented here today is overwhelming, and the claims made by the defendant," he nodded toward the HOA's table, "are not only unfounded, but frankly, quite disturbing." Alyssa's heart raced. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she felt a rush of relief, a sense that justice might actually be possible. The judge continued, his words growing more deliberate. "The actions of this HOA are unlawful. They have abused their power, misled homeowners, and violated their rights. This court will not stand for such behavior." Alyssa's breath caught in her throat as the judge raised his gavel. "I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff. The HOA's claim to the solar panels is null and void, and they are to be returned to the homeowner immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the financial dealings of the HOA and the possible legal violations they have committed." The room erupted into murmurs, but Alyssa barely heard the noise. She was numb, her mind reeling from the weight of the judge's words. She had won. They had won. It wasn't just about the panels. It was about standing up for her rights, for her family, and for every person who had been oppressed by the HOA's reign. The relief was overwhelming, but it was also bittersweet. Alyssa had fought for so long, endured so much, and now, as the reality of her victory settled in, she realized that this battle wasn't truly over. The HOA was still a powerful force, and there were many more homeowners who would need help in the future. But for now, Alyssa allowed herself a moment of peace. She had won her fight, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. As she left the courthouse, her daughter Emily was waiting for her. The moment they locked eyes, Alyssa felt the weight of the past few months fall away. She had done it, for herself, for Emily, for their future. The battle was over, and they had emerged victorious. And in that moment, Alyssa knew that no matter what the future held, she would never stop fighting for what was right. The weeks that followed the courtroom victory were a strange mix of relief and reflection for Alyssa. The victory had been hard-earned, a culmination of everything she had fought for, yet it was impossible to ignore the feeling that the battle was only part of the story. It wasn't just the fight against the HOA that had shaped her. It was the realization of the power one individual could have, the lengths to which she had gone to protect her home, her daughter, and her rights. Alyssa knew that her victory had ripple effects beyond her own house. It had sent a message to the neighborhood, to everyone who had been too afraid to speak out against the HOA. But the victory wasn't just hers. It was a victory for anyone who had been pushed to the edge, for anyone who had felt powerless in the face of authority. The HOA, once a shadow looming over the community, was now reeling from the shockwaves Alyssa had created, and the foundation of its power had cracked. The first order of business after the ruling was the reinstatement of Alyssa's solar panels. The HOA's attempts to remove them had failed in the most spectacular fashion. Their legal claim was invalidated, and the court had ordered them to return ownership to Alyssa immediately. The contractor who had originally installed the panels was called back to do the work, and within days, her rooftop was once again adorned with the clean, shining panels that had started this entire ordeal. Alyssa stood on the roof looking out over the neighborhood, watching as the sun bathed everything in its golden light. There was a strange sense of peace that came with the sight, the sense that she had reclaimed something that was rightfully hers. It was more than just the panels. It was the control over her life, over her decisions. She had taken a stand, and that stand had paid off. But even as Alyssa basked in the satisfaction of the court's ruling, there was a growing awareness of the challenges that still lay ahead. The HOA, while temporarily defeated, was not a simple entity to be dismissed. They were still a powerful force in the community, and it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and began their attempts to reassert control. The reality was that Alyssa had won the legal battle, but the HOA's influence was far-reaching, and there were still many people who were too afraid to speak out or take a stand. The day after the ruling, a neighbor, Janet, who had witnessed the entire legal process from afar, approached Alyssa with a hesitant smile. Janet had been one of those who had always kept her head down, never getting involved in the HOA's activities but also never questioning their authority. But after seeing the way Alyssa had stood up to the HOA, Janet had started to think differently. She was not the only one. Several other neighbors who had remained silent throughout the years now began to speak out, sharing their own stories of how the HOA had overstepped its bounds, imposed unjust fines, and attempted to control every aspect of their lives. It was clear that Alyssa's victory had emboldened them, but the work was far from done. Alyssa had always known that her fight wasn't just about her property. It was about something much bigger. It was about the right of every homeowner to feel safe in their own space, to have the freedom to make decisions that were in their best interest without fear of retribution. She had become a symbol, not just in her neighborhood, but in the larger community as well. The media coverage of her case had gained national attention, and Alyssa found herself in conversations with lawyers, activists, and even local government officials who wanted to discuss the larger implications of her victory. Her fight had raised awareness about the unchecked power of the homeowners' associations, and the legal precedent that had been set during the trial could lead to broader reforms in the way such organizations operated. The HOA, now reeling from the defeat, began to take action. Gavin Ross, the HOA president, tried to save face by issuing a public statement attempting to shift blame onto the legal system. He painted himself as a defender of the community's interests, insisting that the HOA's actions were necessary to maintain order and preserve the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. His attempt to salvage his reputation fell flat, as residents saw. Through his words, Alyssa's victory had exposed the HOA's true nature, and many neighbors were no longer willing to tolerate the intimidation tactics they had used for so long. A movement was slowly taking shape, one that questioned the very existence of an organization that had, for too long, acted as a law unto itself. Alyssa's role in this movement was both humbling and empowering. She didn't set out to become a symbol of resistance, but the truth was that her victory had inspired many others to find their voice. She found herself speaking at community meetings, meeting with local government officials, and even contributing to discussions about how HOAs should be regulated. She knew that the battle wasn't over. Far from it. She had to ensure that the HOA was held accountable for its actions, and that the new rules were put in place to prevent future abuse. Her focus shifted from her personal victory to the broader goal of community-wide reform. There was still much to be done, but Alyssa now had the confidence, the support, and the legal backing to make a real difference. As Alyssa sat in the living room one evening, looking around her home, she felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. The chaos of the past months, the stress of the trial, and the weight of her responsibilities had all taken their toll. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Alyssa could finally relax. She had won. She had not only regained control over her home, but had helped to pave the way for others to do the same. Her daughter, Emily, who had been so distant during the conflict, was now smiling again, sitting at the kitchen table, sketching her own designs. Alyssa had made it through, and now, more than ever, she was determined to ensure that her daughter would grow up in a world where she could thrive without fear, without oppression. But the work was far from over. Alyssa knew that the HOA, despite its temporary setback, would not stop. They would regroup, learn from their mistakes, and try again, perhaps in a more subtle way. There was always the chance that other homeowners would be targeted, that other families would be subjected to the same pressures that Alyssa had faced. But Alyssa was ready. She had made a promise to herself that she would never allow the HOA or anyone else to infringe upon her rights again. The fight had made her stronger, more resilient, and more committed than ever to protecting her home and the rights of those around her. As the months passed, Alyssa watched as her neighbors began to take a more active role in the community, organizing meetings and demanding transparency from the HOA. The old oppressive regime was beginning to crumble, and in its place, something new was emerging, a community where people felt empowered to